Thank you all for being here today. My name is Penny Wright, and on behalf of all of us at the Rogers Memorial Library, we're so pleased to be having a talk about Robert F. Kennedy. I wanted to mention a couple of things before we get started. Many of you are familiar faces, and some of you are not, but I wanted to encourage those of you who may not live in our library district and may not get our newsletter to pick up a newsletter. You see, we've sort of papered over those tables with various different flyers. By no means everything we do, but we tried to put out quite a few things for you to take a peek at after today's talk. I'm only going to mention 3 of them, or maybe 4. 3. Okay, just want to mention, there are 2 programs I especially want to mention because we want people to come and because we think it's really worthwhile. We have a local Southampton physician who is the head of infectious diseases at Southampton Stony Brook, who spends a great deal of his time when he's not doctoring, working with refugees. And he is coming next Monday, June 4th, to talk about his work. He works with several other local physicians. We have very few people signed up, and it's making me sad. We want people to come to this, and I think it's obviously an important topic. And along those lines, we are also screening a film called Human Flow. Some of you have perhaps seen it. It was shown at the Parish Art Museum. It's long. It's 2 hours and 9 minutes. We are serving pizza as an inducement. We hope they come. The other 2 things I'll mention, you can pick these flyers up from the table, but as some of you know, Martin Levinson is the moderator of a very fine, worthwhile, we feel, series that runs from, I believe, March through October called Great Decisions. It's a series about issues of global and national importance, and they are held at Cooper Hall. We like reservations. We're pretty full for these programs, but the 2 coming up are on June 11th, one about the media and foreign policy, and the next on July 23rd about Turkey, a partner in crisis. The rest of the programs, we just help yourself to our flyers and do join us. A few words about Martin Levinson. Since his Brooklyn days, which he chronicled in a book titled Brooklyn Boomer, growing up in the 50s, Dr. Martin Levinson has lived in New York City. Now he's living pretty much full-time or part-time on Long Island. He's worked as a school teacher and a school administrator, and is currently the president of the Institute of General Semantics, which is a think tank based in New York City. Martin Levinson holds a Ph.D. in organizational studies from NYU and is the author of 9 books on topics that range from academic research on drug problems to policies to social satire. He's a member of the Authors Guild, the National Book Critics Circle, and is the book editor for Etc., a review of general semantics. And finally, as we mentioned, Marty Levinson is the moderator for this particular series. He also gives talks on various different subjects here at the library, and his next talk will be on September 27th, and he'll be coming in to talk about the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. So it's a pleasure to have him here. Please welcome Martin Levinson.
Thank you, Penny. Yes, I'm doing a talk on the Tet Offensive because it's the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive, the Vietnam War. I'm doing a talk on RFK because it's the 50th anniversary of his assassination, June 6th. So what would have happened had RFK not been assassinated, had he run for president, had he won? Well, who knows? Anyway, it didn't happen. I'd like to recommend this book to you. A book written by his son. It's called Make Gentle the Life of This World. I think you can get it here at the library. I know I saw it on a shelf when I was leaving once. Kennedy kept a day book where he recorded things that were important to him. And it has quotations and interesting remarks that he felt were important. I'm going to start out, though, by reading from the introduction to the book. This is by Maxwell Taylor Kennedy, and this is what he has to say about his father. My father was of the last generation to grow up in a time when Americans made an effort to remain consistent. Few of his peers thought much about reinventing themselves for some kind of gain. Consistency was prized more than material success. We live in more complicated times. My father was an important bridge between two generations, what was perhaps the greatest gap in the history of the country. They talk about the 60th generation gap. That's where the term actually was coined. Most people became more and more set as they grow older. My father became more flexible, yet his core values and morality remained constant. Americans seem to have two natures, one extraordinarily positive and forthright, the other dark and cynical. Historically, in challenging times, it has been easiest for politicians to appeal to the baser side. Thus, we've had the success of Father Coughlin and Huey Long during the Depression, and later of George Wallace. And this is an aside. It has always struck me as odd that virtually all of the Democrats who supported George Wallace had previously been RFK Democrats. The same Americans who voted for Wallace were able to share RFK's vision of this country, a much different view. I've never come across a public pronouncement by RFK in which he made an appeal to the darker side. So it's interesting that RFK was actually able to pick up support, not just among Democrats, but among Republicans. And actually, George Bush dedicated the Justice Building in 2001 to RFK. And the bridge in New York, the former Triborough Bridge, now the RFK Bridge. So it's interesting, RFK appeals to both liberals and to conservatives. William Buckley was at his funeral. Everyone know Chris Matthews? You don't have to watch MSNBC, but if you know Chris Matthews, he actually wrote a book on RFK. He's written a couple of books on JFK. He wrote a book about RFK. And he said that JFK was a realist who was thought of as a romantic. And RFK was a romantic who was portrayed as a realist. RFK was sort of the guy that got things done. When JFK ran for Senate, it was RFK who managed his campaign. Sometimes you think of RFK in the hearings, the Rackets hearings, for McCarthy. RFK was the tough guy, the guy that got things done. And he was a tough guy in many ways. But he was also a romantic. If you read the book, you'll see all kinds of allusions to Camus, to poets. He was very deeply a Roman Catholic. He actually prayed every night. He had the children pray, etc. He was 42 years old when he died. He was killed by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian born in Jerusalem, who said that he killed RFK because he thought RFK was supporting a deal where the United States would sell 50 jets to Israel. And he felt that was bad, and so he killed him for that reason. So you could argue that Sirhan Sirhan was the first Mideast terrorist. And also he's been, occasionally he tries to get parole, or I guess that's what it's called, and he keeps getting turned down. Anyway, he was the seventh child, RFK, of Joseph Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy had 9 children in all. RFK had more children, 11. So the Kennedys like to have lots of children. His mother, Rose Kennedy, had an agenda. She said everything should have a purpose, and the kids were really striving all the time. The father was the tough guy. Rose was sort of the sweet woman, sort of good cop, bad cop, but they really wanted their children to be very successful. Actually, Joseph Kennedy wanted one of his children to be president. The child he wanted to be president was his oldest child, Joseph Kennedy. Sadly, Joseph Kennedy was killed during World War II flying an airplane, special mission, and the plane blew up. So that was the first child he wanted to be president, so then he had to go down in chronological order to the second child, which was JFK. And JFK actually became president with a lot of help from his father. His father donated tons of money. Money counts in politics, no surprise. And the father donated tons of money to the campaign. JFK became president, and then, of course, he was assassinated. So that third in line, who's the third in line? RFK. Now, RFK wasn't running for president, but then the Vietnam War happened, and I'll get to that. In any event, Kennedy's moved to Bronxville. Kennedy, when he was growing up, he spent lots of time in Hyannisport and Palm Springs. He had a big interest in history and was a philatelist. Do you know what a philatelist is? This group, I bet, knows. Younger people, when I talk about it, what's a philatelist? Stamp collector. But when we were growing up, and you guys are too young, but when I was growing up, it was a big deal. My father was a stamp collector, I was a stamp collector. Who collects stamps today? Your grandchildren collect stamps? Maybe. I doubt it. In any event, he was a philatelist. As a child, he strove to meet his mother's expectations to become the most dutiful, religious, affectionate, and obedient of the Kennedy children. Very sweet kid, always obedient, always trying to do the right thing. He first went to a Protestant boarding school, which his father wanted, and then went to Catholic boarding school, which his mother wanted. He became a devout and practicing Catholic. When he was younger, he made newspaper deliveries. He had a job. But the way he made the deliveries was in a Rolls Royce with a chauffeur. But still, it was a job. He didn't have to do it. He didn't need the money. He was a compassionate public figure. He played for the Harvard football team, even though he was a little guy and probably, might have been rejected. But he tried so hard. He was on the Harvard football team. It was a big deal to be on the team. He took a BA in political science from Harvard. He worked as a Middle East correspondent for the Boston Post. He was pro-Israel, and I wonder if Sirhan might have seen those articles too. He was pro-Israel even back then in '48. He married Edith Skakel in Greenwich, Connecticut. They had 11 children. Beat his father. Anyway, there's something called the Kennedy curse. Have you heard that? Because, the oldest child died, then JFK was assassinated, then RFK was assassinated, then Ted Kennedy, Chappaquiddick, but even before Chappaquiddick, Ted Kennedy was in a plane crash where he broke his back and people in the plane were killed. Robert Kennedy had a sister, Rosemary, who behaved kind of oddly and badly, and his father arranged for her to have a lobotomy. Not because he thought it was going to do her damage, but because he thought it was helpful. The doctors at that time said, if you give her the lobotomy, it'll take away this erratic behavior, and it will be good for her. Anyway, it was a horrible operation, and they had to pretty much seclude her from the family. I'm sure he felt pretty guilty about that, but that's another sort of part of the Kennedy curse. Edith Skakel, Robert Kennedy's wife, her parents died in a plane crash. So, money can't insulate you from everything in life, as I'm sure you know. In any event, RFK, as I said, was a nice guy. Once, when he ran a dog over, he knocked on all the doors in the neighborhood to try to find out who owned the dog. So he was a nice guy, too. In 1951, he travels on a trip with JFK through Asia. In 1951, he moves to D.C. to work as a lawyer in the Department of Justice. In 1952, he resigns to manage his brother's campaign for Senate. The idea was to become a representative, which JFK did, and to become a senator, and then hopefully go on to become president, and so he managed his brother's campaign. Joseph McCarthy, remember the McCarthy era? Joseph McCarthy, I have 42 communists here in my pocket. I have the names. And the next day I have 320 doing crazy stuff. In any event, the Kennedys were pretty close to Joseph McCarthy. As a matter of fact, when they were to condemn McCarthy, JFK didn't show up for the roll call vote. Now, why were they friendly with McCarthy? Well, they were Catholics, and they were also very anti-communist. Sometimes we forget the tremendous anti-communism that people had back in the 50s. We thought the Russians were willing to drop nuclear bombs on us. And certainly the Russians after World War II were taking over all these countries in Eastern Europe. So there was a lot of anti-communism back then. JFK was anti-communist, RFK was anti-communist, Joseph McCarthy was anti-communist big time. So was Nixon. That's how Nixon started his career, basically, before McCarthy. In any event, JFK became chief counsel working with McCarthy. Became chief counsel against McCarthy during McCarthy hearings But he worked with McCarthy as a lawyer when McCarthy was pursuing this anti-communist stuff. In 1956, he became an aide to Adlai Stevenson. Remember poor Adlai Stevenson had to run against Eisenhower? Nobody could have beaten Eisenhower. Adlai Stevenson was sort of a sacrificial Democrat to run against Eisenhower. In any event, he never liked Adlai Stevenson, RFK. He, of course, famously was on the McClellan Rackets Committee where he squared off against Jimmy Hoffa. He was on a mission to get Hoffa. Hoffa, he felt, was a criminal, and he was going to put him in jail, and he kept grilling Hoffa, and Hoffa basically stood up to it. I never pleaded the fifth, which was interesting. He always answered the questions. Barry Goldwater and Carl Mundt attacked JFK for going against Hoffa and said he was a shill for Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, which I don't think is true. They also said he was ruthless, and he condemned people for pleading the fifth, which of course people tend to do. I mean, I think our president condemned people for pleading the fifth, our current president. In 1960, RFK published a book called The Enemy Within, which is a bestseller about his experiences against union practices. In the presidential primary race against LBJ, when JFK ran against LBJ, not against LBJ, in the primaries, LBJ wanted to be back in 60, wanted to run for office, and so LBJ tried to take down JFK by saying JFK had Addison's disease, which he did, right? But RFK said, no, he doesn't, and because they didn't want that to be known. And RFK really had this vendetta against LBJ for just bringing it up, even though it was true. So RFK and LBJ never got along. And when he was picked by JFK to be his vice president, that really went against what RFK wanted to have happen. He tried to convince LBJ not to pick, what was the initials? JFK not to pick him for president, but vice president, but he did. In any event, of course, they won narrowly. You know, the JFK-Nixon race was a very small percentage, less than 1%. And probably Illinois was one of the deciding factors. And what happened in Illinois, in Chicago, Richard Daley had the Illinois machine. And all the other counties in Illinois came in with their election numbers, and Chicago came in last. And probably because Daley wanted to know how many votes he'd have to need to beat the other votes, which is probably true. Also in Texas, Johnson was able to, I think, do some stuff. So one wonders why Nixon didn't appeal the election, which he could have. But to his credit, he didn't. He just said, okay, I lost, that's it. I don't think it would have happened today. I think it would seem to appeal, but Nixon never appealed it. Okay, so in any event, JFK becomes president. RFK then becomes very involved in civil rights, much before JFK. RFK got Martin Luther King released from the jail in Atlanta. JFK, of course, appointed RFK to be Attorney General, you know, which is appointing your brother to be Attorney General. That sort of started ethics laws, not laws, but ethics rulings, because you shouldn't have a family member serving in the cabinet. That was after RFK was appointed. And JFK really didn't know how the public would feel about having RFK as the Attorney General, having his brother appointed. But he said, okay, let's see what happens. And they made the announcement, and it worked out. Anyway, RFK was a tough Attorney General, lots of convictions, went after labor racketeers big time. There were accusations, actually, they had no experience with the position, but he had lots of experience in fighting organized crime, and that's basically why he came on. Remember the Cuba blockade? You're too young. But I remember the Cuba blockade. In any event, RFK was really influential in coming up with a solution to finally getting a breakthrough, because I mean, back then, you probably, like me, were petrified that there was going to be a nuclear war. I mean, what really saved the day was sort of this back-channel deal with Khrushchev, that if Khrushchev would take the nuclear missiles out of Cuba and not bring any more in, we'd remove missiles from Turkey. But we didn't want to be embarrassed, so we didn't announce it. We just sort of said, okay, that's what we'll do. A few months later, we did do that. but RFK actually was helpful in getting that deal done. By the way, when LBJ appointed or wanted RFK to be appointed, they did a voice vote in the Senate because it was felt that if they did a vote by hands, he would have lost. So they did a voice vote. So we think I don't know about you, but I think politics is pretty crazy today. It's always been tough. I mean, I think today it's worse in many ways, but there's always been deals done. On the last night of the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK said, "Thank God for Bobby." So clearly Bobby Kennedy was important. Also, at the end of the Cuban crisis, the CIA had pretty much convinced Kennedy to do the Bay of Pigs. And after the Bay of Pigs failed, both RFK and JFK were very wary of the CIA. It was interesting. In any event, as Attorney General, RFK, convictions rose against organized crime by 800%. So RFK was a tough Attorney General. Hoover disliked Robert Kennedy because he was unable to control him. Hoover's an interesting guy. It's a library. You should read a biography on Hoover. No president wanted to get rid of Hoover because Hoover knew where all the skeletons were in the closet. So if you wanted to get rid of Hoover, he could sort of dump a lot of dirt on you, and that wasn't good. So Hoover was really holding all these presidents blackmail, using blackmail ultimately to make sure he was in office. But anyway, he disliked Robert Kennedy. Actually, when JFK was shot, basically Hoover was the first one to call RFK and said, "Just want to let you know your brother's been shot." He wasn't compassionate, he wasn't empathetic, just said it and hung up the phone. So not a nice guy. In any event, in 1964, Hoffa was finally imprisoned for jury tampering, not for the racketeering. So it was like when Al Capone went to jail for income tax, not for all the other stuff he did. And RFK also pushed by Hoover, which is interesting. RFK was the one who authorized the wiretapping of Martin Luther King. So we think, of course, of RFK as sort of very progressive with civil rights, but RFK was also a law and order guy. And it's interesting because he was this law and order guy and a progressive on civil rights. He was appealing to two constituencies, the white working class and the more progressive voters. So that's why I think had he run for office, he would have had maybe a good chance of winning. But we'll never know. At any event, when he sent federal marshals to Oxford, Mississippi to desegregate the University of Mississippi when James Meredith did that. After JFK was killed, the Kennedy took charge. He was the one that ordered locks changed on the president's files and asked if the CIA had been involved with JFK's death. I don't think he was ever really convinced of the Warren Commission report, that it was one person acting on his own. And a lot of people aren't convinced. I'll just do a...
Neither was Johnson.
Well, I'll ask people in this room, how many of you were convinced about the Warren Commission? Raise your hand. Look around. So how many were not convinced? 31? That's right. I think most people were not convinced. And of course, yes.
There was a scientific study done, I don't know if everybody saw it, about 5 years ago. These experts on ballistics and whatever, and it was a very, very convincing presentation that there was only one person and one guy.
What the Warren Commission got wrong was the number of bullets. They thought that the first bullet was, in fact, they got the order wrong. The second bullet, the third bullet, they went to the third. So that's what they got wrong, but I agree with this gentleman.
No, they did an amazing job with geometry, measurements.
They did, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to come back one day and do a talk on the Warren Commission because it's
I
such
forgot
an
where I
interesting
saw it.
topic.
I saw it about
PBS.
5 years, was TBS?
PBS.
Yeah.
It was a really
Well,
remarkable study.
Also, my next book should be about this because if you write a book about it, people are going to buy it. So, Brooklyn Boomer was good, but it won't have the sales of this other book. Okay. In 1964, at the Democratic Party convention, after RFK was assassinated, RFK got into the race late. Johnson, because the Vietnam War was the thing that destroyed Johnson, the legacy. It was really sad. Johnson had this great society where he was passing all this immense legislation, civil rights legislation, immigration legislation, huge legislation. But then he inherited this war, and he doubled down on the war. Of course, he had all these bright people telling him, and this great book on the Vietnam War, if you want to read this, The Best and the Brightest, probably some of you read it, by David Halberstam. It talks about all these Ivy League advisors that Kennedy and Johnson had that were steering them in the wrong direction. But in any event, Gene McCarthy, remember Gene McCarthy? Entered the race just because he was against the Vietnam War. He had no real interest in becoming president before that. But he felt he wanted to run against Johnson in the primary because there were so many people wanting us to get out of Vietnam. So he ran, and late in the day, after McCarthy had been in for a while, RFK threw his hat in the ring. But I mean, late in the day, and there was not good blood between McCarthy and RFK, because McCarthy felt RFK should stay out of the race. How many peace candidates do we have? But in any event, of course, RFK was killed in California. There was a primary in California, and McCarthy and RFK were in the primary. He was killed at that time. And the Democratic primary, his brother, Ted Kennedy, gave this quote about what happened. This is, let me go back. It's not that quote. What happened at the primary, I think RFK got into the race March 16th in 1968. March 31st, LBJ got on television and made a stunning announcement. What was the announcement? He wasn't going to run for president. And he hadn't told a lot of his advisors that he wasn't going to run for president. And of course, when he announced he wasn't going to run for president, this meant that there was going to be RFK, McCarthy, or the establishment candidate who was Humphrey. Right. So, we won't know what happened because RFK was out of the race. Let me just go back a bit. So, we talk a little bit about the Warren Commission. I actually mentioned this, I'll throw this in, I'm sure it'll make you two fellas happy. One of RFK's sons said in a Charlie Rose interview, there was evidence that RFK thought the Warren report was, in quotes, of shoddy craftsmanship. In any event, Robert Kennedy was a supporter of getting rid of the death penalty. In 1964, of course, before he became candidate, what office did he hold in New York? He was a senator from New York. Right. So was Hillary Clinton, senator from New York. You don't have to be a New Yorker, apparently, to be a senator from New York. We like national figures in this state. But he became a senator from New York, and he was an idealistic guy. This is from a 1966 speech he gave at the University of Cape Town. And he said, RFK, each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. RFK supported gun control. By the way, his death and the death of Martin Luther King was assassinated only a couple of months before RFK was assassinated. 68 was a tough year. You had the two assassinations, and then of course you had the unfortunate primary in Chicago with all the demonstrations. The Chicago police really ran amok, doing violence against demonstrators. It did not help the image of the Democratic Party. Anyway, he supported gun control, and after the deaths of Martin Luther King and RFK, the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed. He helped start a successful redevelopment program in Bedford-Stuyvesant. He worked with the National Farm Organization to support workers' rights. He spoke forcefully for the disaffected, the impoverished, and the excluded. He called the Vietnam War the gravest kind of error and advocated a change of policy vis-a-vis the war, but he was a hawk in that war up to 1965. So we had a change of position. In a speech at the University of Alabama while running for president, RFK said, I believe that anyone who seeks high office this year must go before all Americans, not just those who agree with them, but also those who disagree, recognizing that it is not just our supporters, not just those who vote for us, but all Americans who we must lead in the difficult years ahead. Wouldn't it be great if we would hear that kind of talk today, to unite people of different persuasions? Robert Kennedy was perfect for the age of television. you look good. You know, and we really live in the age of television. Can you imagine a guy like Taft, who weighed 325 pounds, running for president today? Wouldn't be nominated, wouldn't look good on television. I don't think Abraham Lincoln would have had a shot. In the age of television, you gotta be somewhat photogenic and entertaining.
Well, who Lincoln was against, he didn't have a shot either.
Well, no, those, well, right, but right, okay. Humphrey was the establishment favorite, got the nomination, and RFK and lots of people were against him. RFK once gave a speech to medical students, and when they asked him, he said, you know, we need to raise taxes to help everybody. And so when they asked him, where would he get the money from to do this? He said, well, I'll get them from you, because you're going to be successful doctors, and you have a responsibility to society. So he was willing to, you know, speak fairly truthfully about that. He was a liberal who told white audiences that it was important to have racial equality. He talked about lowering taxes for corporations and the need for strong law enforcement, which made him popular with people like Bill O'Reilly, who was a big fan of RFK. Let me see, I have something here on page 4 of the book. Again, I encourage you to get this book. I'm sorry to bring my reading glasses with me, but I'll see what I can do. On page 4, he said, we all struggle to transcend the cruelties and follies of mankind. The struggle will not be won by standing aloof and pointing a finger. It will be won by action, by men who commit their every resource of mind and body to the education and improvement of their fellow man. So he really was a person who really wanted people to get out there and help other people. I told you about a Bobby lived. This is the eulogy that Edward Kennedy gave of his brother. It's really kind of moving. He says, my brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. To be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. Those of us who loved him and who take him to his rest today pray that what he was to us and what he wished for others will come someday to pass in the world. As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and to those who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not? Those are certain lines. Now, I'm going to show you about 10 minutes from a history DVD of his campaign. And then I'm going to take questions. You probably have some. So, let's do it. Analogy is a blessing and a curse. That's not my original one.
Some among us say the Negro has made great progress, which is true, and that he should be satisfied and be patient, which is neither true nor realistic.
The civil rights struggle had been at the center of Bobby Kennedy's political life, but in 1966, another issue was beginning to crowd its way onto the 40-year-old senator's agenda. The war in Vietnam, which Bobby once supported, was turning into a quagmire for American troops.
I have to have some differences of some importance with the administration in connection with Vietnam.
As the war escalated, Robert Kennedy became one of the most prominent and eloquent voices of dissent. The more he spoke out, the more some began to look to Bobby as a candidate for the upcoming presidential elections.
I wrote a very tough article addressing Robert Kennedy, saying, you must run. This is your duty to run for president. And I thought he would be really mad at me, but when I saw him a couple days later, I said, before I could say anything, he said, my wife loved your article. She cut it out and Xeroxed it and she sent it out to everybody.
Ethel was pushing him to run. I mean, Ethel was the moral force. Bobby was hesitating, but Ethel just forcefully said, this is the moral thing to do, he should do it.
Bobby began to think seriously about running, but Eugene McCarthy was already in the race, attracting anti-war activists and liberal Democrats determined to unseat incumbent Lyndon Johnson. In making his decision, Bobby turned to the man whose favor he sought as a child, his father, Joe.
And I remember thinking as I was standing there with my dad, how vulnerable my father looked, asking this, paralyzed man lying in a bed whether he should run for president. And my grandfather saying that he should run.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
As he got out on the road, Bobby's candidacy quickly gathered momentum.
There were so many crowds just crushing in on him, wanting to touch him, wanting to be with him, filled with hope about what he could accomplish.
2 weeks into Bobby's campaign, President Johnson withdrew from the race. It was like a shot of adrenaline for Bobby. 5 days later, he was preparing a speech before a mostly black audience in Indianapolis when he learned that Dr. Martin Luther King had been assassinated in Memphis. Bobby delivered the tragic news to the silent crowd.
I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man.
There was something about him that when he spoke that they understood and felt, and were relieved to hear.
Bobby attended Dr. King's funeral, then pressed on with his run for the presidency. After winning primaries in Indiana, Nebraska, and South Dakota, Bobby threw everything he had into winning California. On June 3rd, the day before the election, he campaigned in 5 major cities, covering over 1,200 miles in 13 hours. Bobby's hard work once again paid off. The early returns came in on primary day. Bobby was the projected winner over opponent Eugene McCarthy. Around midnight, he addressed an overflowing ballroom of supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago and let's win there.
Bobby left the ballroom and veered into a corridor off the hotel's kitchen. The kitchen staff had come out hoping to shake Bobby's hand. Waiting among them was an unemployed drifter named Sirhan Sirhan. As Bobby approached, Sirhan opened fire with a snub-nosed pistol. One bullet caught Bobby behind the right ear. He fell to the ground. As Sirhan was subdued, Bobby lay dying on the floor, Ethel by his side. He would cling to life for more than 25 hours before dying at 1:44 a.m. the next morning. During a funeral mass held at St. Patrick's Cathedral, Bobby was eulogized by his only surviving brother, Teddy.
To be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it.
After the funeral, Bobby's body was put aboard a train bound for Washington, D.C. That evening, on June 8, 1968, Robert Francis Kennedy, only 42 years old, was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. 30 yards away from his slain brother. Bobby Kennedy, once the lost child in a competitive family, died before he could show his true potential. Whether squaring off against corruption or inspiring others to fight against war and injustice, he showed signs of the president he might have been.
I think Robert Kennedy was the best politician I ever saw and now realize we'll ever see.
He never wavered. He never gave up. He never gave in. He never gave out.
As long as he was alive, it seemed like there was ultimately a force in this world that would set things right.
I think my father's greatest legacy was that each of us should make a difference, to help others, not to sit by, but to get in the center of the arena.
I always think it's a good idea to show a film and see the person. We can kind of all have memories, but also I know Netflix, forget Netflix, they're doing a miniseries now on Bobby Kennedy, president. I think you've seen it.
It was very good.
Okay. All right, so if you have Netflix, I haven't seen it yet, but it's one thing you could do. There are lots of books on Kennedy. I mentioned Chris Matthews written a book. I happen to think this book is pretty good. Make Gentle, his life. I could be right. Anyway, this book, lots of books on Kennedy, but let me give the remaining time to answer questions if you have any on RFK. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think one of the things that I saw the Netflix show as well was quite good. And it made more, I think, than you have in this 10-minute spiel did about the extent to which Kennedy, much to the dismay of many people who did honor and value him, his refusal to run. He was approached by Alec Lowenstein as early as 1966. Said no, said no, said no, said no. Now, the reason why that, I would surmise why that happened was that, and this is, again, from an admirer of him, I admire him greatly, but his activities versus Castro, Operation Mongoose in the White House, were such that the campaign to kill Castro went on to the date of JFK's death. Johnson had that information. Kennedy's refusal to get into the race until McCarthy had entered and had shown that Johnson was vulnerable. I still, to this day, I was alive when I was 12 years old in 1968. I think it's unforgivable because if you're going to stay out of the race and then you're going to cede that ground to McCarthy, you don't get in until you see that Johnson is vulnerable. I think on 2 counts, it's a great mark against his legacy. Lots of kids died at the time that he was lost. He could have, I think, in a way that McCarthy never could have possibly done, galvanized the anti-war movement, and I think it's a shame that he didn't.
Well, I think that those are reasonable comments. I mean, certainly, he wasn't an anti-war. He changed his position. So for lots of that war, he was a hawk, and then he changed the position. So I think that's also, I think he thought he was going to run in 72. And it was kind of early, same thing with Humphrey, it was kind of early for everybody, because everybody assumed that Johnson was going to seek re-election.
And he desperately wanted to be Johnson's running mate in 1964, which was, when you think about it, he hated Johnson.
Yes, and Johnson hated him.
And Johnson hated him.
Right.
And Johnson dangled that.
Yes.
And I think he humiliated RFK.
Right.
Again, I wish RFK had not wanted that. It was never going to come.
Thank you. I think yes, thank you.
I think in the case of following up with this in 1964, yes, there's no way that LBJ was going to permit RFK to be Democratic Vice President elected.
Right.
But he did do something for RFK, which really probably was the thing that actually propelled him later on. He's he really, between being elected senator and being defeated by, I think it was Kenneth Keating, the Republican, a very popular guy. They had to go into a residence at the Hotel Carlisle for a number of weeks to kind of wash away the carpetbagger image that he was maintained, but even though he was born in Bronxville.
Right, he mentioned that actually in the campaign.
He had a claim to being a resident of New York State.
Sure.
But again, you can't say a lot of people come to New York because of the opportunity. So, and RFK's, LBJ's huge victory over Goldwater pulled RFK to win. If it hadn't been for the LBJ landslide, he would have lost.
That's exactly right. What happened then? That's exactly right. His numbers lag JFK's in New York State, marking.
Yeah.
You're right.
So we should thank Goldwater. Or or they should thank Goldwater. Although largely Goldwater was then responsible for other things. But yeah, that's right. It was an astounding, smashing election. Thank you. Yes.
My question is to why did Hoover agree to beat Bobby in New York City instead of Bobby going to Hoover? Because Hoover knew everything about everybody that ever ran for president.
That's right.
Okay? We know this.
Okay.
But yet he met Bobby in New York City. Why?
I don't know.
It's a good hope.
I mean, maybe he was in the neighborhood.
No, the reason why I'm asking this question is because it seemed like Bobby knew something on Hoover. You know,
that's possible.
About his brother being shot and carried.
So maybe Hoover had some fear that RFK would expose Hoover, etc. That's possible. I mean, you know, people knew things about each other, so I know something about you that's no good, you know something about me that's no good, so we both don't say anything. Yeah, that's possible. Yes.
Can you identify what in his background, in the early background, was the basis of his conversion in the late non-progressive liberal?
He did.
Marty, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, what was in RFK's background? He became, you know, somewhat of a progressive. Poverty was very much, you know, for legislation to help in that area. Civil rights. What in his background caused him to take these positions? It's a good question. He's certainly more progressive than his brother JFK. You know, perhaps growing up a good Catholic, wanting to, like the Pope, you know, really wanting to help people. That certainly could be part of it. I think Attorney General just traveling around, seeing people, actually getting into seeing people. You know, when you're very privileged, often you simply aren't exposed to these things. I remember famously, you know, George H.W. Bush, when he was online at the supermarket, didn't know how to go to the kid, didn't know how to scan things. He'd never been to a supermarket, and you can't blame him because that was it. He just never was exposed. I think RFK probably wasn't exposed as a younger person, but he became Attorney General, he would take trips, he would see things. And I think just being exposed to things, it happened to FDR, I think, when he was in Lawrence Springs, Georgia, he was exposed and seeing poor people, and that might have been partially responsible, although his wife is more so for the New Deal. So maybe it was just the exposure and growing up very religiously and believing stuff in the Bible that many people just give lip service to, he might have actually believed it. Yes?
There is I don't know how to express it, but apparently in the election of Kennedy, the mafia was apparently involved.
JFK.
Yes. I mean, is this correct? And that the RFK won after the Union, after being, you know, in the position that he was, vice president.
Right, and JFK, yeah, I think that is fairly correct. And JFK was not happy with his brother going after these people who had helped him. But RFK went against his brother in that way. That is true. So that's an idealistic position. So there, Robert Kennedy was more the romantic and JFK was more the realist. Even though when you think about it, JFK is always portrayed as a Camelot romantic figure. But JFK was pretty much a realist. You know, he was also somewhat conservative, and economics he was pretty conservative. You know, he wanted to lower taxes on corporations big time.
The other thing is that JFK was sleeping with Sam Giancana's girlfriend.
Yeah, Judith Exner, that's right.
Throws another.
Right. So you had more to, right. That's right.
That's what initiated Hoover coming in to speak to the Attorney General and the President to tell them that not to go off. Which might also go back to the gentleman's question about why Hoover was meeting with Kennedy for.
Oh, that's interesting. RFK.
That could be a connect.
Yeah, no, that's right. That could be. And actually, Hoover did say that to JFK, and JFK told Hoover, "You're right, I will not get off." And of course, he did it. You know, because if you have the affair, the danger, you know, not just the affair, the danger is other countries can blackmail you. I mean, today I'm not sure how that works. Morality seems to go out, but in those days, it was a serious consideration. They didn't want the affair known. You know, but yeah, thank you.
Not even scratching the surface of his involvement, his father's involvement.
That's right. The father was heavily involved in stuff like that. And the father made a lot of money in the 30s with rum running and all kinds of stuff with prohibition. There's an interesting, if you want to read an interesting biography, read a biography of the father. The father had an interesting life. Yes.
Very interesting life. Plus, on top of it, politically, he was pro-Nazi.
The father.
Yes.
Yes, it
when he
cost
had
him.
his position in England.
Yes, it cost him his job, basically. I mean, Roosevelt said, you know, you can't be for the Nazis. And, you know, you can't. And actually, the father, I think, had wanted a political career. But he picked the wrong side, so once you're for the Nazis, you're not going to go too far in national politics. So that was it for him. That's what he looked to his sons. So that's a good point. Yes?
I just want to say that I'm not sure what year it was, but I was teaching at Queens College, I was an instructor. And Robert Kennedy gave an address at one of the graduations. And he came down the reception line of the faculty, and I was able to shake his hands. And I got to tell you, he was an incredible face. He was very dark, tan. I think he had some steely gray hairs, and his eyes were very blue, faded blue.
Yeah.
It was quite an experience.
He's a good-looking guy.
His physical charisma.
Yeah. And then look, remember the famous TV debates, JFK versus Nixon? And they always say, well, JFK won the debate because he looks so good on television. Television is not about what you say, as Donald Trump knows. It's about how you perform and how you look. And JFK in those debates come up from Florida, tanned, rested. Nixon was sweating, he was sick, he refused to wear makeup. You know, it was a disaster on television. But yeah, RFK very telegenic, which in a telegenic age, it's important. Yes.
What do we make out of this business with Sirhan may not be the only shooter? I mean, has anybody been reading that this week?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean.
What do you make of it?
I don't know. His son seems convinced.
Yes.
He went to the prison, he spoke with him for 3 hours, and he said he was shot from behind.
Right.
And Sirhan was in front of him, and so
Right.
we're going to open up a whole kettle of fish on this one now with another shooter.
I think so. Because don't forget, we live in an age of social media and television, and something like that happens, you know, it will be discussed. I can't see
But when a
that.
family member is involved in it
Right.
to this degree, it kind of gets a little more attention.
It does. And you wonder why now. I don't have any answers. I'm not on the inside. I mean, like you, I'm on the outside, looking in. But yeah, so that's a good point. I did read that this week, that accusation had been made. And so you'll hear more of it on television, because that's what television does. Okay, well, thank you. You've been a great audience. I hope you learned something.
Thanks so much, Marty. Thank you all for coming. I do hope you will join us again for our Great Decisions programs in, I think, June 11th, July 23rd, and then see you again in September. Thanks again for coming.